The tack room at Hartwell was cold before the household woke, and Miss Cecily Vane preferred it that way. She had arrived in the dark, as she always did, the lantern in her hand throwing a narrow corridor of gold across the stone flags. The smell of leather and saddle soap and horse sweat was familiar as her own skin, a smell that belonged to her more honestly than the name she had been given at birth. She set the ledger on the mounting block, uncapped the ink, and began to check the morning figures against yesterday's entries. Oats allocated to the hunters. Hay baled and counted. A discrepancy of 2 shillings in the farrier's account that had bothered her for 3 days. She heard him before she saw him. A boot on the threshold, unhurried, then the door swinging open and the night air cutting past the lantern flame. The Earl of Rayburn stood in the doorway in his riding coat, without a cravat, as if he had dressed in haste or not slept at all. He was taller than the doorframe seemed to expect, dark-haired and angular, with a face that had been formed for control and kept it now by habit. His eyes moved across the tack room in the manner of a man assessing an account, quickly, with nothing wasted. They landed on her. She did not move from the mounting block. There was no graceful way to explain herself, and she had learned, in 24 years, that explanations offered to men of rank were rarely improved by offering them. "The ledger," he said. His voice was low, level, the consonants clipped in the southern way. "Whose?" "Mine, my lord. I keep the stable accounts." A pause. He came fully into the room, and the lantern caught the planes of his face and the hollow beneath his jaw. He did not look at her with cruelty. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man who had expected to find the room empty. Then his gaze moved past her, to the far wall where the saddles rested on their brackets. He went still. He walked toward them without another word. She watched him touch the nearmost one, a large saddle in dark brown leather, old but well oiled. His hand moved along the cantle and paused at the panel beneath, where the leather was slightly proud of its backing, as if something lay beneath. A crease that was not part of the saddle's construction. He pressed it once, then lifted his hand and said nothing. He turned back to her. "How long has this room been in your keeping?" 2 years, my lord. And this saddle, my brother's. Has anyone disturbed it?" She thought of old Jenkin, who polished Hugh's saddle each Friday as a kind of memorial, and had once said, half to himself, that the old master had seemed troubled the last week before his ride, that he had visited the tack room twice at odd hours and once been found stitching something himself. She had not thought to ask what. "Not to my knowledge," she said carefully. He looked at her for one moment longer than the question required. The lantern light caught the gray in his eyes, and she felt the room change its temperature, though nothing in it had moved. Then he nodded, turned, and left without taking the saddle with him. She did not know, standing there in the cold with her ledger still open, that the north was already beginning to move beneath her feet. Cecily Vane had come to Hartwell as the steward's daughter and stayed as the steward's daughter's orphan. Her father, Thomas Vane, had served the former earl for 20 years, keeping the northern pasture accounts and the stable inventory with the kind of quiet competence that earns a man trust, but rarely reward. He had died of a winter fever when Cecily was 17, leaving her a small box of books, a careful handwriting, and a talent with figures that no one at Hartwell quite knew what to do with. Old Jenkin had given her the stable books because there was no one else to take them, and because she had been doing the addition in her head beside her father since she was 10. That was how it had been arranged, nothing more formal. She lived in the upper room of the north cottage, took her meals with the household's secondary servants, and was paid a wage that covered clothing if the clothing was plain. She had no prospects beyond Hartwell, no patron, no family connection to invoke. To the estate, she was useful. To the season, she was invisible. To Lady Ashmore, who had arrived 18 months prior to manage the household during the earldom's administrative delay. She was something less than that. The ledger girl. Lady Ashmore had called her the first week, speaking to her niece, Miss Priscilla Ashmore, in the blue sitting room with the door insufficiently closed. The words had reached the corridor where Cecily was carrying a folio of accounts to Mr. Dowell, the steward, and she had walked the remaining 12 feet to the steward's study without altering her pace or the neutrality of her expression. She had not felt the words until that evening, when she was alone with the ledger and the lamp and the long dark outside the cottage window. She had not cried. She had counted the oat entries instead, twice, until the feeling passed or became something she could carry. That had been the autumn. Now it was February, a pale and bitter February with snow still caught in the angles of the northern fells, and the Earl of Raeburn had arrived from London 6 days ago to conduct an audit of the estate and determine whether Hartwell would be retained or sold. He was not what she had expected. She had expected London in his manner, the refined distance of a man for whom the north was an inconvenience. He was distant, yes, but not in the careless way. He read the account books himself. He walked the fells in the early mornings, before the household was awake, and returned with mud to the boot top and a gravity in his face that had nothing to do with fatigue. He had corrected a discrepancy in the grain accounts on his second day, quietly, in the margin, in a hand as precise as a solicitor's. On the third day, he had come to the tack room at midday with a question about the horse rota, and she had answered it, and he had not thanked her, but had stood for a moment after the answer, as if he expected her to say something further. And when she did not, he had said, "The accounts are in good order," and left. It was the closest thing to a compliment the estate had offered her in 2 years, and she had found, to her irritation, that it settled somewhere in her chest and did not entirely disperse. Miss Priscilla Ashmore had arrived on the 4th day with a carriage full of trunks, and a composure so practiced it read as weather rather than effort. She was tall and fair-haired, and dressed with the specific perfection of a woman who knows she is being positioned, and she wore it without complaint. Lady Ashmore had arranged her niece in the best guest room and at Edmund's right hand at dinner and at the pianoforte after. And Cecily, passing the drawing room with the evening stable report, had seen Priscilla play, and had seen Edmund listen without expression, and had told herself, not without effort, that the observation was not her concern. If Edmund noticed Miss Vane at all, she told herself, it was only because the accounts required it. She was not certain she believed herself. The witnessing happened on a Tuesday, in the light rain that came off the fells just after noon. Cecily was in the small harness room adjacent to the main tack room, writing a correction into the grain register, when she heard the outer door open and the footstep she had learned to distinguish from the household's other footsteps, though she would not have admitted to learning it. She kept writing. Then she heard the second set of footsteps, heavier, belonging to Mr. Garvey, who managed the property's day labor, and who had served Lady Ashmore's administrative preferences with a diligence that Cecily found, on 2 previous occasions, troubling. The lady would like the stable book to show 18 bales, rather than 22, for the fortnight of January, Garvey said, in the tone of a man repeating instructions he has memorized. It keeps the household accounts in balance with what she has told the London solicitor. Cecily set down her pen. She looked at the page in front of her. 22 bales, counted herself, entered in her own hand. The stable book shows 22 bales, because there were 22 bales, she said. Miss Vane. A warning in the word, small and certain as a stone. I cannot alter a figure I counted myself. If Lady Ashmore believes there is a discrepancy, she may speak to the head groom, who was present for the counting. I will not change what I recorded as true. Garvey left without another word. She did not know that Edmund had been standing in the corridor beyond the harness room door since Garvey's second sentence. She did not know he had heard every word she said. She did not know that he stood there for a full 30 seconds after Garvey's departure, with his hand pressed to the doorframe and a look on his face that the corridor wall kept entirely to itself. She was still writing in the register when he entered the harness room from the courtyard side, rather than the corridor, and asked her a question about the February horse rota. And she answered it. And she did not see the quality of attention he held on her face while she spoke. That evening she brought the amended hay accounts to the study, where Edmund was working alone at the broad desk his brother had used, the desk that still held a few items she recognized as Hugh's, a penknife with a bone handle, a letter rack with a red ribbon still tied around it. The candles were burning low, and the fire had sunk to orange. She placed the accounts on the corner of the desk and said, "The February hay count, my lord." He did not take them immediately. He looked at her with the particular stillness that had, in 6 days, begun to unsettle her composure in ways she could not account for. "Sit down, Miss Vane." It was the command shape his voice took, always, the short declarative that acknowledged no option, and she had learned in 6 days that it was not unkind, that there was something inside it that was almost the reverse of unkind, though she could not have named what. She sat in the chair opposite the desk. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "My brother Hugh managed this estate for 4 years before his death. Did you know him?" "A little. He came to the stables sometimes in the late mornings. He was kind to the horses." Something moved in Edmund's face. A compression, a settled weight. He turned the pen over in his hand, set it down. "He died on the moor road," Edmund said. "In January, 14 months ago. Ice on the stones." She waited. There was more. She could feel the shape of it. "I sent him north." The words were even, but even was what happened when a voice had been controlled a long time over something that had not stopped hurting. There was a land dispute. A tenancy question that might have waited until spring. "I sent him in January because I was occupied in London and believed it expedient." The fire shifted and spoke in the grate, and said nothing useful. "You could not have known the road would ice," she said. It was not a comfort she offered easily, but it was a true one, and she had found that true things, however plain, were what he seemed to need, rather than managed sympathy. He looked at her then, a look that lasted long enough to feel like a held breath in the room. The candlelight found the angle of his jaw, and she was aware of the ledger between her hands and the stillness of the house beyond the study door, and the small warm space the firelight had made of the room, and the fact that his hand had moved slightly on the desk toward the account she had brought him, before stopping in a way that was not quite a reaching and not quite a stillness. "The saddle," he said. "Hugh's. I noticed something in the panel this morning. I have been thinking about it since." She held still. "I have not opened it." She did not know why she said what she said next, only that it felt true. "Whatever he put there, he put it for you to find." He was quiet for a long time. The candle nearest the window guttered in a draught. "Thank you for the accounts, Miss Vane." She rose, set the ledger on the desk, and walked to the door. She was almost through it when she heard him say her name, not with a question in it, only with the weight of a man confirming something to himself. She went to the cottage and did not sleep easily, and did not examine why. The dinner Lady Ashmore arranged for the Wednesday was one of those northern household dinners designed to resemble something larger, 12 places laid at the long table, the silver polished, the best candelabra brought up from storage, and Miss Priscilla Ashmore dressed in pale rose silk, with her hair done in the fashion Cecily had seen illustrated in the London publications that sometimes arrived in Mr. Dowell's post. Cecily was not at the table. She ate, as always, in the servants' hall, and she did not begrudge the arrangement because it was correct, and she had never been invited into the arrangement's alternative. She had finished her meal and was taking the evening tally to the stable ledger room when she passed the dining room's east corridor and heard Lady Ashmore's voice carrying through the partially open door in the way that voices do when wine has made a speaker careless. "The girl with the stable books," Lady Ashmore was saying to someone close beside her. "A steward's daughter. She has made herself indispensable in the accounts, I am told, though I cannot imagine any use for that beyond what she already performs. One cannot account for all the ledger girls the North produces." There was a murmur of agreement, and then the sound of glass on linen. Cecily did not stop walking. She carried the figures to the ledger room, closed the door, and sat at the small table with the lamp and the columns of numbers, and she was careful, as she always was, and the figures were correct, and the lamp burned for 2 hours more while she worked. She did not permit herself to wonder what Edmund had heard. The next morning she overheard one of the younger footmen, speaking in the courtyard to the undergroom, say that Lady Ashmore had told Mrs. Parkin, the housekeeper, that the ledger girl ought to be pensioned north and a proper clerk engaged in her place once the Earl had made his domestic arrangements. The footman said this without any particular feeling, as one reports weather. Cecily stood in the stable yard with a bucket she had meant to carry to the trough, and felt the cold come off the stones, and did not move for a moment. Then she set the bucket down, returned to the tack room, and did what she always did when the world drew its conclusions about her. She worked. The day passed. Edmund was absent from the estate in the afternoon, riding with Priscilla and Lady Ashmore toward the northern pastures at Lady Ashmore's arrangement. Cecily saw them go from the high window of the tack room. 3 horses, the rose of Priscilla's riding habit bright against the gray-green of the fells. That evening, Mrs. Parkin came to the cottage. She was a decent woman, Mrs. Parkin, and she had the decency to look at the floor when she delivered the message. Lady Ashmore wished Miss Vane to understand that the Earl would be attending the Northern Assembly at Carlton Hall on the Friday evening, and that an announcement was expected. Lady Ashmore further wished Miss Vane to understand that her services through the end of the quarter would be compensated, but that a new arrangement for the stable accounts would be made at Lady Ashmore's discretion. Cecily listened to all of it. "I see," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Parkin." When the housekeeper had gone, she sat in the chair by the window and looked at the fell through the dark glass. Snow had begun again, fine and pale, catching the lamplight from the cottage window. She would leave before the assembly. It was cleaner. She would finish the quarterly accounts and bind them and leave them on the desk, and take her box of books and walk to the Newcastle coaching road in the morning. She had £12 and 7 shillings in the wooden box under the bed. She had her father's handwriting in the account books, which meant she could find another situation if she were precise about it. She had been useful here. It had not been enough. It rarely was. She began to pack. Edmund Rayburn could not sleep. He had not slept well since Hugh's death, and he had come to regard the hours between midnight and 4 o'clock as a kind of penance he served, rather than a rest he was owed. He rose when the house was fully quiet, pulled on his coat, took a candle, and walked the corridor toward the stable block, without a clear reason for the direction. He told himself it was the account. He told himself it was the ordinary due diligence of a man reviewing an estate he might dispose of. He told himself many things, walking the dark corridor, and the things he told himself grew less convincing the closer he came to the tack room door. The saddle was where it had been. He set the candle on the ledge and stood before it for a long time, one hand at his side, the way a man stands before a door he has put off opening. Then he took out his penknife and worked it along the seam of the panel beneath the cantle. Careful, until the leather separated from its backing, and the folded paper, oilskin wrapped, fell into his hand. He did not sit down to read it. He stood, unfolded the oilskin, and read his brother's handwriting by the single candle's light. Hugh had a graceful hand and a plain directness in writing that Edmund had always recognized as one of Hugh's better qualities. He wrote without ornament when the subject was serious. This subject was serious. Father, Hugh had written, was married before mother, and the marriage was lawful. Her name was Mrs. Elspeth Drummond of Kelso, a widow, and they were married in Edinburgh in 1787. She died in 1789, 8 months after delivering a daughter. Father had suppressed the record and sent the child to the Drummond family, who placed her in the care of a man named Thomas Vane, a trusted steward who had married Elspeth's cousin. The child grew in the Vane household as Thomas's daughter, having no knowledge of her mother's prior history. Her name is Mary. She has since died. But her daughter, the young woman now keeping the Hartwell stable accounts, is Elspeth Drummond's granddaughter, and therefore our half-niece through father's first lawful union. Edmund stopped reading. He read it again. He is the true heir of the entailed northern pasture lands, not because the law demands it of him, but because Hugh had written, with the clarity of a man who had understood something before riding into the dark and the ice. The land was placed in trust for Elspeth's line by the original deed of settlement. I believe the Northern Trust does not resolve through us. I am riding north to speak to Clough, the Newcastle solicitor, who has the original deed. I cannot act on this without you, Edmund, but you should know. Hugh had written the letter and stitched it into the saddle on the morning of his last ride, as though he had understood, somewhere below reason, that the ride was uncertain. Edmund stood in the tack-room with the letter in his hands and the candle burning low, and he thought about a woman sitting at a mounting block with a ledger, in the dark. Before the house was awake, he thought about 12 pounds and 7 shillings in a wooden box, which he did not know about, though he would. He thought about a steward's daughter who could not alter a figure she had counted as true, not for threats, not for ease, not for the comfortable arrangement that would have made her life at Hartwell safer. He folded the letter and put it inside his coat. He blew out the candle. He stood in the dark of the tack-room, in the smell of leather and saddle soap and cold stone, and felt the north settle around him in the way it settles around those who actually belong to it, and the something that had been locked inside him for 14 months opened, not violently, but the way a door opens when the key is finally the right key, the way a ledger balances when the missing figure is at last supplied. The Northern Assembly at Carlton Hall on the Friday was attended by every household of consequence within 12 miles, which in Northumberland in February meant perhaps 40 people, and a string quartet from Newcastle, who had arrived in bad humor and played with technical precision and no warmth. The candles in the long room were good ones, beeswax and plentiful, and the stone walls had been hung with winter greenery in a gesture toward the season's aspirations. Lady Ashmore arrived with Priscilla on her arm and Edmund at her other side, and she wore the expression of a woman executing a long-prepared maneuver. Priscilla was in ice blue. Edmund was in his navy tailcoat, without expression, and he had not yet looked at Lady Ashmore directly once in the carriage from Hartwell. Cecily was not at the assembly. She had told herself firmly that she would not be. She was at the cottage, her box on the bed, her books packed, the lamp burning on the last entry of the stable accounts. She had written it in her best hand, a clean transfer notation, a record so complete that whoever took the accounts next would find nothing wanting. She was sealing the ledger when she heard the knock at the cottage door. It was Mr. Dowell, the steward, who looked as if he had walked fast from the manor house and was not entirely certain of his errand. "The Earl has asked for you, Miss Vane. At Carlton Hall." She looked at him. "He sent me in the gig. He was very particular." She looked at her coat on the hook, the box on the bed, the sealed ledger. "Miss Vane," Dowell said, not unkindly. "He was very particular." She put on her coat. The hall was warm after the cold of the road, and the assembly was at its middle point. The dancing paused. The company gathered in loose constellations of conversation. Cecily came in through the side door on Dowell's arm and stood at the edge of the room in her plain gray wool, which was neat and carefully mended and was still plain gray wool, and she felt the room in the way she had learned to feel rooms, with a peripheral awareness of who was looking and who was not. Lady Ashmore was standing near the fire with Priscilla at her right hand and a small, attentive cluster of the neighborhood's senior matrons. She was in the midst of a sentence, her fan open, and she was looking toward the room's center, where Edmund stood with a glass he had not touched, talking to an older man Cecily did not recognize. The older man, she would learn, was Mr. Clough of Newcastle, who had arrived that morning at Hartwell with the original deed of settlement folded inside his document case, and who had spent 4 hours with Edmund in the study before dressing for the assembly. Edmund saw her the moment she came through the side door. He did not cross the room immediately. He looked at her with the full quality of attention she had felt in the study over the accounts and the dying fire, and then he excused himself from Mr. Clough and walked toward her, and the room did what rooms do when the most compelling figure in them moves with purpose. It noticed, it quieted in the small, incremental way of people who have not yet decided they are watching something. He stopped before her. He was close enough that she could see the letter folded in his breast pocket, the corner of the oilskin above the line of his coat. "Miss Vane," he said. She waited. Her hands were still at her sides. She was waiting for a direction, a question. Some transactional purpose for being summoned from her packing. And she had prepared herself for it. And she was not prepared for what he actually said. "You were leaving." It was not a question. "I had completed the quarterly accounts," she said carefully, "and packed your books." She said nothing. "Dowell told me." A pause. "I asked him to." Lady Ashmore's voice carried across the room in a moment's lull in the quartet's tuning, brisk and certain as a gavel. "Miss Priscilla, the Earl must be introduced to the Norbury family before the next set. He has a particular obligation to them." Edmund did not look toward Lady Ashmore. He kept his eyes on Cecily's face. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the folded letter. He said, "I want you to read this. Not here. Not tonight. But you must know it exists before anything else occurs in this room." She took the letter from his hand. Her fingers touched the oilskin, and she felt the slight irregularity of it, old and careful, the way something is wrapped when it is meant to last. "Edmund!" Lady Ashmore, arriving at his elbow in a practiced glide, her voice calibrated to exclude without being audible, as excluding. "Miss Vane will understand that this is not the appropriate moment for estate business, the ledger girl of all occasions." A smile for Cecily, brief and cool as a window shut against rain. "We are grateful for your work through the quarter." Edmund turned. He had not raised his voice. He would not raise his voice. The room's quieting happened on its own, the way the room's quieting had been prepared by 30 seconds of the neighborhood watching the Earl of Raeburn cross a room toward a woman in gray wool with an expression no one in the assembly had yet categorized to their satisfaction. He said, in the level declarative that acknowledged no option and needed none, "Miss Vane is my cousin, and Hartwell belongs to her line." The room did not exhale. The room held itself. Lady Ashmore's fan stopped its motion. Priscilla, 3 steps behind her aunt, looked at Edmund with the expression of a woman who had prepared for one evening and was now being present for a different one entirely. She was not wicked. She had been placed. The distinction mattered. And the look on her face in that moment was one of recognition rather than malice, as though some part of her had always understood that the arrangement was not certainty. Mr. Clough moved from across the room with the unhurried pace of a man who has been waiting for his entrance and arrived at Edmund's left side, opening his document case with the quiet authority of a solicitor who has carried the correct papers 100 miles for precisely this moment. Lady Ashmore said, "This is absurd," but the word came out smaller than she intended, as though the room itself had adjusted the acoustics. Edmund did not respond to her. He looked at Cecily. "The letter is from Hugh," he said. "He had discovered the truth in the weeks before his last ride. He rode north to secure the deed with Clough, and he left the letter for me to find when I was ready to look. I was not ready until 2 days ago." Something shifted in her chest, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the finality of a figure brought into balance, a column that has carried an error for years and suddenly resolves correctly. She looked down at the letter in her hands. Her father's name was in it. Her mother's name was in it. A life she had not been told about was in it. She did not say anything. She could not yet. Edmund did not require her to say anything. He looked at Mr. Clough, who confirmed the deed's provisions in 3 sentences, clear as entries in a ledger. The room had the quality of a room that has understood something and is still deciding how to arrange itself around the new knowledge. The senior matrons near the fire looked at one another with the expression of women recalculating. One of them, Mrs. Norbury, who was old enough to remember the late Earl, said quietly to her neighbor, "Well, Thomas Vane always did carry himself as a man with a private understanding." Lady Ashmore said something sharp and retreated toward the far end of the room with a dignity that was still considerable because she was formidable by nature, and formidable people do not cease to be formidable simply because a room has voted against them. She would arrange herself. She would find the story that preserved her position. She was confidently wrong, and the evening had informed her of it. And she would carry that information away and do something with it that was hers to do. Priscilla looked at Cecily once. A direct look of the kind that comes when one woman is accounting for another honestly. And then she turned away and spoke to Mrs. Norbury about the road conditions from London, and that, quietly, was the end of it. Edmund said, very low, for her alone, "Come home, Cecily." It was the first time he had said her name. She felt it land in her the way the cold came off the fells in the early mornings, specific and unambiguous and entirely real. She said, "I still have to unpack my books." Something moved in his face that she recognized, after a moment, as the first honest thing she had seen there. A warmth that had been kept behind the jaw's careful line and was now permitted one visible fraction of itself. "Yes," he said. "You do." The ride back to Hartwell was quiet, the snow falling again on the fell roads, the gig moving slowly through the white. Cecily sat beside Edmund and held the oilskin letter in her gloved hands and did not read it again, though she had read it twice in the carriage coming to the hall. She thought about her father, Thomas Vane, who had kept a household secret for 30 years with the care he brought to all his accounts, never claiming more than his position afforded him, never pushing at the edges of the arrangement. She thought he had probably known more than he said, and she thought he had chosen to give her a plain life rather than an uncertain claim, and she could not find it in her to be angry with him for that, though she sat with it in the cold and the snow and felt its weight. She thought about Hugh, who had ridden north in January to secure what was right and had not come home, and whose letter had waited in a saddle's hidden seam for a year and 2 weeks, patient as a true account. Edmund said, "The northern pasture lands are held in trust under the original deed. Clough has the paperwork. There is a process, but there is no serious legal question." "I understand. Hartwell will not be sold." She looked at him in the darkness of the road. "I was going to sell it," he said. It was a confession of the kind a man makes when he has decided to stop keeping the account closed. "I had decided before I arrived. I had no attachment to the place. I told myself it was expedient. I had been telling myself expedient things for 14 months. The gig moved through the snow. The fell on either side was blue-white in the dark. "Hugh loved it," she said. "Yes." He said once to Jenkin that the north was the only honest place he knew. Jenkin told me. He said Hugh meant that the north did not pretend to be warmer than it was. Edmund was quiet. She felt him considering this, the way she had learned in 6 days that he considered things, fully, and without hurrying. He said, "I have been pretending to be colder than I am." She looked at the fell and felt her pulse in the hollow of her throat, and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. The kind of silence that holds the weight of something real without crushing it by naming it too soon. They reached Hartwell at close to midnight. The stable lamps were burning, and old Jenkin was waiting, which she suspected Edmund had arranged, because Edmund arranged things with the kind of forward attention that looked like cold management and was actually the opposite. She went to the tack room. She did not know she intended to until she was standing in it, the lantern in her hand as it always was, the stone flags cold as they always were. Hugh's saddle was on its bracket, where it had been for 14 months. The leather still good, because Jenkin had kept it so. She touched the panel where the letter had been. The leather was open now. The stitching pulled back cleanly. The hollow empty. She pressed it once, as Edmund had done in the dark of the morning that had started all of this. She heard him behind her. She had not heard him follow, but she was not surprised. He came to stand beside her, not quite close enough to touch, which was how he had stood near her consistently, a proximity maintained at its exact calibration, like a figure in an account that has been placed correctly and will not be moved. She turned to look at him. The lantern light caught the oilskin letter, still folded in her hand. "Hugh put it where he knew you would eventually come," she said. "He knew I would come to Hartwell. He knew I would come to the tack room eventually, because I cannot stay away from accounts that require attending." A dryness in his voice, the first she had heard, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch. "He knew me better than I knew him." She looked down at the letter, her mother's name, written in Hugh's hand. She thought of the north, honest as the fells, cold as it was, and not pretending to be warmer. And she thought of a man who was colder on the outside than he was within. And she thought of her father keeping his ledger with perfect accuracy for 30 years. And she thought that all of it, all the concealment and the cold and the careful maintenance, had been in service of something that was finally true. She held the letter out to him. He took it from her hand, and his fingers brushed her gloved ones, and neither of them remarked on it. And the unremarked thing was warmer than anything the room contained. "I would like to stay," she said, "if the position is genuine." He looked at her. He had the look of a man who has worked out the answer to a difficult equation and is choosing whether to write it in the margin or state it directly. "The position," he said, "is permanent, and not the accounts." She felt the color rise in her face, which was not what she had planned, and she was glad of the lantern's limits. He was looking at her with that quality of attention that had begun in the first dark morning and had never entirely ceased. The look that said she was seen, specifically, by someone whose seeing was not casual. "You will have to speak to me properly," she said, "when you are ready." "I am already ready," he said. "I have been ready since Tuesday." She thought of Tuesday, the harness room, Garvey's voice and her own, and him in the corridor, which she had not known about then, and knew about now. "You heard." "Every word." Outside the tack room, the snow was still falling on the fell. It fell on the gray stone of the stable yard, and on the north pastures, and on the moor road where the ice came in January, and it fell with the neutrality of the north, which does not soften and does not pretend. It covered everything equally. It had no opinions about ledger girls or steward's daughters, or the distance between a plain gray coat and a navy tailcoat. It was still falling when Edmund reached out and took Cecily's hand, the gloved one, and held it with the care a man takes with something that has been in the wrong column for too long and has at last been placed correctly. She let him hold it. She looked at Hugh's empty saddle, the panel open, the hollow aired. The letter was accounted for. The figure was in its right place. The North had named its heir, and the heir had come home. If something in Cecily's story settled in your chest tonight, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. Thank you for staying until the end.